have been an anime fan for quite a few years now, and I've seen my fair share of anime. All your mega long shonen anime, Naruto, Bleach, One Piece, Gintama, My Hero Academia, not Fairy Tail because I respect myself, but there's always been one mega titan that I never felt ready to watch. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. You know it, you've seen the memes, heard the mudas, you've referenced it and you don't even know it. Over the years, I've heard so much about JoJo's, but behind all the references, reaction images, and people just never shutting up about it, I still had no idea what it was about. And so earlier this year, young and naive Davis took it upon himself to try and watch all of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and in a time where I'm leaning away from battle shonen anime, because frankly, they're all too similar, I was expecting JoJo's to fall into that same category. But when I started watching, I was greeted with something so different and out there, so bizarre, that I couldn't help but keep my eyes glued to the screen. And after 5 parts and 156 episodes, I can finally say with full certainty, I am a JoJo's fan. But with this watching experience being the roller coaster that it has been, it inspired me to make this video, where I will be going through each and every JoJo's part and just kind of breaking down everything, telling you what I like and dislike, and just kind of going over the evolution of the series. So let's go into it, starting with part 1, Phantom Blood. Phantom Blood is widely considered the weakest part of the series, and a lot of people would even call it boring, and I think that comes from a misunderstanding, because boring is not a term that I would ever use to describe part 1 of JoJo. I think what happens is everybody hears about JoJo's and hears people talk about the insane stands and the crazy fights, and when you start it, you get Jonathan who's using breathing techniques and they're fighting vampires. Wait a minute, is this just gay Twilight? The first part of JoJo's feels more like reading a one-shot that was later turned into a big manga like Wanted for One Piece or number 9 to Jujutsu Kaisen, because there's no stance, only breathing techniques. No, not those breathing techniques, this breathing technique. The fights aren't super fluid or fast-paced, and to be honest, Jonathan Joestar, the protagonist, just isn't that interesting early on, and I do think you can argue that Dio is the protagonist for the first half, but still, Jonathan, not too interesting. But I think if you come into the show without any of the massive expectations from all the memes and the fan base, you will find that this is the framework that would later turn into one of the most unique and expressive pieces of art I have ever seen, because not even the word bizarre can begin to describe part 1, because even 5 minutes into the show, they already made it clear this is not going to be a normal journey. When I saw Dio get out of the carriage, instantly knee Jonathan's dog in the face, and then square up on him for no reason, I looked like that meme of the gamer sitting up in his chair. I mean, these guys got in a fight, and Dio lost, and then when Jonathan came home from school, his dog was in the incinerator. Like, how are people saying this is boring? It's so insane and out there. This show just exaggerates every little thing, from the art style, the characters having very defined faces, using sharper edges and actually giving them noses, the disproportionate bodies and oversized muscles, the clothes they wear directly reflecting the character themselves. Dio is just cartoonishly evil. Jonathan is the very embodiment of a hero, a good-hearted and kind individual. It's just everything you've come to know and love from the hero beats the villain story, but cranked up to 1 million. Characters hold the iconic JoJo poses just because it's an awesome way to visually show how a character is feeling, and it just has so much style and flair. And I just want to finish off talking about Dio for a second, because I think the greatest strength of part 1 is in its villain Dio. The biggest strength of the series in general is just the raw amount of style it gives off, for no other reason other than it's cool to the mangaka of JoJo's, Hirohiko Araki. And I think Dio embodies this very idea all the way to its core. Why did Dio kill Danny? Because he's Dio. Why did he hate Jonathan so much? Because he's Dio. If Dio was a D&D character, he would have his charisma stat maxed out, because no matter how much you dislike him, you can't help but also love him at the same time. And that's kind of the series in a nutshell. You can dislike it, but damn it, you can't take away those style points. All in all, I think this is a very solid introduction to this series, and I don't actually think it's the worst part. We will get there later. And I think just the pure level of wackiness in this part is truly unique, even among JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I do think the ending of part 1 was very shocking and not something you normally get from your shonen anime. So, 8 out of 10. 49 years after the events of Phantom Blood, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Battle Tendency starts off in New York in the 1930s. And this is where it feels like Araki really started to get an idea of just how crazy he wanted to be. In part 1, he was wacky, but in part 2, he plays into that times 100. One of my favorite examples of this is in the introduction of our main character, Joseph Joestar, where he ends racism by juicing a cop in the face and then infusing a bottle cap with hormone and shooting a cop's fingers off. Not to mention later in the episode when he meets Straightzo and proceeds to pull out a Tommy gun like a GTA character and just mag dump him. Where did he get the Tommy gun? Who cares? He then proceeds to spawn a grenade, multiple grenades, and stick them to Straightzo. Where did he learn all these tricks? What? I think this is probably as wacky as the show gets until part 5, because everything in this part is insane and almost nothing is given an explanation. Much like how Dio is the perfect villain for this series, I think that Joseph is the perfect protagonist, because the heart of this series is being different, and in the first part, he made a very bog standard heroic protagonist, and Joseph is practically the exact opposite of that. Joseph is cocky and arrogant, yet still has a strong moral compass. While Jonathan would rather fight a straightforward and honorable fight, Joseph will do anything to win, and often resorts to tricks and strategy. And when you're fighting in insane ways, like infusing clackers with hormone while fighting an Aztec god, it only makes sense that your main character would be doing things like spawning in weapons, running away in the face of danger, and just constantly predicting what people are going to say before they say it. He's just a larger-than-life character in this larger-than-life show, and I would go as far as to say he's one of the only JoJos so far that has had real character growth throughout his entire run, because Joseph from the first episode is almost unrecognizable from the Joseph at the very end, as he learns through tragedy and through training that he needs to be more serious. And overall, I just think Joseph as a character is the most enjoyable JoJo. And I haven't even mentioned out of all of the side characters in this entire series, I think that Caesar may be the best Joe Bro of them all. He complements Joseph so well. He's the descendant of Baron Zeppeli, the master of Jonathan Joestar, and is seeking to avenge his bloodline. And although at first he's presented as the opposite of Joseph, as the season goes on, you begin to see more and more similarities between the two, both being cocky and prideful while constantly bickering and using each other as motivation to go stronger. And it was around episode 19 of the first season of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure where I really started to understand why this show is so widely praised, because Joseph and Caesar got in an argument, and you all know what follows. This scene is where I really fell in love with the show. I was watching this show because it was fun, it was over the top and insane, but I never expected to have a real emotional investment in the characters. It was only after Caesar's death that it really began to hit me just how invested in these characters I'd become. Seeing Caesar put the final bit of strength he had into getting Joseph to cure, not to kill the enemy in front of him, is a perfect end to his character arc. And seeing Lisa and Joseph attempt to keep their composure only just to lose it and completely break down, I was breaking down right there with them. And when a show can balance those wacky and insane antics, as well as also have these strong emotional moments that feel really real and in tune with the characters, it's really just something special. And I haven't even talked about the final fight yet, which is just as batshit and insane as everything else in this part. And I just think to the core, it's some of the most fun I've ever had watching a show. He doesn't try to make it feel grounded in reality. The main character is just as goofy as the show itself. Like, he literally spawns in a plane. And although it still uses the power system of hormone, it is clear that this is the part that set the groundwork for what JoJo's would become. I give Battle Tendency a genuine 10 out of 10 because it's practically everything I love about anime turned up to 1 million. Na 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 na. Alright, now we are moving on to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3, Stardust Crusaders, and this is where things get a little bit spicy because I think far and away this is the worst part in JoJo's. Not only do I think it's the worst part, I think at points it's flat out bad. Now there will be a lot of complaining in this part, so let me get the positives out of the way because I do think there are a lot of good things at this part. Let's start off with the obvious. Stands are awesome. I'll get more into stands at the later parts because Part 3 does have the weakest abilities, but the physical manifestation of a person is definitely my favorite power system of all time. There are still some really cool stands like the gambling one, Star Platinum, Za World though, and I just think it's really cool getting to learn more about how stands work. An example being the rule that a more powerful stand needs to be operated from someone close by, while a quicker and less powerful stand could be operated from far away. I really enjoyed the cast of characters, as this is one of the strongest casts that we've had, and I just think every character in the main cast complements each other very well, and I had a lot of fun seeing them interact. Because this is the first part that took place at modern times, back then 1989, and you begin to see at that point modern fashion trends sneaking into the look of the characters. Joseph looks straight out of Indiana Jones, and this would later go on to become a big staple of the series, so it's always just cool seeing flashes of what was to come. As always, Dio is awesome, and I absolutely adore the art style. But now let's go on to the negative. I want to just preface all of this by saying that I completely understand how experimental this part was, as he changed the entire power system and was trying a really new spin on the series, and in retrospect, I like this part a lot more. That being said, this is the longest in the entire anime, and so much of this feels like filler. There's 48 episodes in this part, and the entire crew is assembled and heading to Egypt to fight Dio by episode 6, and it feels like almost nothing of meaning happens until they finally end up fighting Dio. It's the exact same formula done over and over again for 40 or so episodes. They see something weird, they wonder if it's a stand, they second guess themselves saying, oh no, it's not a stand, oh no, turns out it was a stand. They fight the stand user for 2 episodes and then they move on, only for the exact same thing to happen again and again. The characters never seem to learn anything, as they just continue to make the same mistakes over and over again, and without the great power system, I think the section would be borderline unwatchable. Some parts in this stretch are still good just because of how interesting the powers can get, but for the most part, I just found myself pretty bored. One of the main things that kept me going during this boring stretch was Abdul's death, because it made Polnareff learn that he needed to take things more seriously and just lock in, but it turns out that they faked Abdul's death, and then Polnareff goes back to being the exact same goofy person. And it was just super frustrating to watch, because this part had every single thing I liked about JoJo's. It had the adventure aspect, good characters, a crazy power system, but it just fell flat on delivering on every one of those things. That was until the very end. Once they finally get to Dio, Araki dropped the weights. He started dealing more with the mystery aspect that would end up becoming so prevalent in the series, trying to figure out what Dio's seemingly invincible ability is. Polnareff and Iggy vs Vanilla Ice made all real men cry, and the fight between Dio and Jotaro is one of the most satisfying payoffs in the entire series. And I think one of the main themes throughout the first 5 parts of the show is that if there's one thing I'm sure of, the end of a JoJo's part will slap hard. I think the peaks of part 3 are the highest we've had throughout the first 3 parts, but the lows are just so boring and frustrating in my opinion that I have to give this part a 6.5 out of 10. On to part 4. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Diamond is Unbreakable, pretty much takes everything that was good about the first 3 parts and builds upon it, because this part slaps. First off, this is when the stand abilities really start to get weird, and we start to see just how many insane abilities this man Araki could come up with. The main character, Josuke Higishikata's ability, Crazy Diamond, is one of the coolest in the series. It's a short-range, power-based stand that can destroy and then rebuild and heal anything, and one of the most fun parts of this season is just seeing all the creative ways this power is used. Koichi Stand echoes part 1, which is able to write an automatopoeia on anything and make that person or object make the sound from there on out. Rohan Kishibe turning people into manga and then being able to write rules that person has to follow in said manga. And I think this is just where the power system really begins to stand out among others, because in part 3 they really just felt like more basic, this one shoots fire, this one is strong, this one is fast. But the powers are so weird and niche in part 4 that you begin to see ideas explored through battle that you would never find in any other manga, and the abilities really begin to feel like they're less focused on how powerful they are, but more how smartly you can use your abilities. And even a rat with an above average intelligence level is almost able to take down Jotaro, the strongest stand user. I can't talk about part 4 without talking about the change in art style. I'm sure everyone can relate to seeing Jotaro in part 4 for the first time and then looking up why the art style changed, and pretty much everyone finds the same reason. Araki just wanted to try something different. He wasn't into the disproportionate bodies anymore, the defined faces, so we get a smooth looking art style for this season. I also want to talk about the jump in animation as well as the use of colors in this part, because David Productions absolutely killed it with this. The way they colored the town completely changed the way I look at color in anime and just furthered the bizarre feeling of this small town. On top of the quality of the abilities themselves going up, the animation takes just as much of a jump as everything from the auras to the background, and the movement is by far the best we've seen so far. I also want to talk about the small town the story takes place in, Morio. This is, in my opinion, the best setting of a JoJo's part through the first 4. I think it was a really smart idea to keep the them in a small town rather than have this grand adventure across the world like the last two parts, because the lack of stakes in the first half is one of its biggest strengths in my opinion, because they are given so much more time to explore each character, establish the powers, and just establish the entire town without it feeling like it's dragging or taking away from the main plot. And the other parts just didn't have this liberty. In part 1, Dio's taking over the world. In part 2, Aztec gods are trying to take over the world. And in part 3, they're rushing across the world to defeat Dio and save Jotaro's mom. In part 4, there's just an arrow giving people abilities, and later on it turns into a murder mystery. And although I think this is one of the weaker main casts, all of their friendships and interactions feel a lot more legit. They don't just fight and then resolve their issues immediately. Rohan still hates Josuke for a long time. Koichi and Yukiko have a whole romance arc. Hell, they run into aliens at one point. And although I know this slice of life style isn't for everybody, I think it makes Morio feel so much more lived in and real. So although the characters themselves might not be my favorite, I still enjoyed all the episodes I spent with them. And now it's time to talk about the biggest strength of this part, the second half. I think the second half of part 4 might be the best that JoJo's has ever been, because once they introduce the main villain, Yoshikage Kira, this part kicks into high gear and starts to show off JoJo's biggest strength, the villains and the mystery surrounding them. JoJo's villains of the past were always these large-scale and crazy evil bad guys who want to take over the world and have absolute power, but not Kira. Unlike villains from the past parts, Yoshikage Kira is the most human-like villain we've had so far. He's just a normal guy who wants to live a normal life. He doesn't want crazy power or respect. He just wants to remain unnoticed while also getting away with murdering a few women, of course. But I think that's what makes him so much more terrifying. He's not a cartoonish evil that's far too separated from reality. There are people like this in our world, and once he's fully introduced and he kills Shigechi, I think you really start to get the payoff from the first half, because this small town slice of life, almost sitcom feeling is instantly flipped on his head as the show turns more towards a murder mystery, psychological thriller as everyone rushes to find the culprit. His stand, Killer Queen, is a great representation of how powers have changed, because it is seemingly invincible and he can blow up anything with just a single touch, making it easy for him to hide any and all evidence, while also making his ability effectively be touch equals dead. And later on, his ability evolves even more to allow him to rewind time an hour. So how can you even beat this guy? Again, it's just really good writing. And just like everything so far, the end of part 4 absolutely slaps. As Kira's son realized Kira is not his father, Kira puts a bomb on his son that will kill anyone who is told his identity. And after a Steins Gate-esque time loop, which if you know me, you know I love me a time loop, the son finally gets Kira to accidentally reveal himself in front of Josuke, finally ending the time loop. And this is where we see yet another amazing use of Josuke's ability, where he hits glass and restores it to the original location, in turn piercing and hurting Kira. Everything from there finally leads to his defeat, and the conclusion is just so satisfying and worth the payoff. Anime and manga often suffer from bad endings, but so far JoJo is 4 out of 4, and I am giving part 4 of JoJo's a 9 out of 10. And now we're finally moving on to the final part I'm going to be talking about in this video, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5, Golden Wind. Fighting Part 5 follows the son of Dio, Brando, Giorno Giovanna, but technically he is a Joestar because Dio used Jonathan's body to make him. I don't fucking know. The story follows Giorno as he attempts to move up in a crime family in order to gain the power to help people. He meets Bucciarati, a member of the gang who's attempting to become a capo, and after overcoming a trial, Giorno is able to join under Bucciarati, and we get introduced to our crew, which is probably the strongest so far. And I can't talk about this part without bringing up the art style, because look at these designs, baby. The whole reason I was able to get into this series was just the raw amount of style it has, and it feels like part 5 he finally cracked the code. First off, Araki fully ditched the Fist of the North Star muscly style in favor of slimmer and more dripped out characters, and I am here for it. The characters in JoJo's have never felt like they belonged in that world. I mean, Jotaro's literally 15 in part 3, and in a part where abilities get so much weirder and more specific, it also makes sense that each character would give off equal flair as their ability. This is the part that really pushed the meme of JoJo's being gay, because these boys are all over each other, and I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it's some deeply suppressed feelings inside of me, but there is nothing cooler than a bunch of fabulous men posing all over each other like Greek gods. Something about it just makes me want to go invade Troy, and I cannot explain how well enough he played into the exaggerated world of JoJo's with this part. Araki is obsessed with Italy, and you can see that all the way down to the architecture. I want to talk about the stands in this part, because this is by far the most insane and amazing stands we've seen so far. Remember how I said part 2 is the goofiest until part 5? Well, part 5 is able to match that same energy, but instead of it being being just plain stupid, the abilities are just so insane and far out there that it never failed to surprise me. Every single stand is named after or related to a band or musician. For example, our main character's stand is Gold Experience. Real quick, I just want to note that all the names in the anime were changed due to copyright, but it's named after a Prince album and gives Giorno the ability to breathe life into any object and control it. Naranja's stand, Aerosmith, is a fighter drone that can detect people through their breathing and then shoot them. Man in the Mirror, which gives Luso the ability to separate a stand user from the stand in a mirror dimension for a practically guaranteed win. And overall, the stands are just so much fun to discover. I think one of the best things about this part is how different the formula is. Giorno doesn't really have an immediate connection to any of the past characters, and after him and Koichi go their separate ways, they never really interact with a prior cast character until much later on, and the main cast of characters all share a common goal from the very start: to find out more about the boss and to move up in the gang. And I just believe that this part has the best and most compelling narrative from beginning to end. The group is given the task to deliver the boss's daughter to him, and they go in hopes of seeing the boss's face. And again, I think this is the best that they've done on the adventure side of things, because they aren't traveling all the way across the world, they keep it grounded in Italy. And every single place that they go to has so much more love put into it. And much like I felt part 4 did a good job to stay in Morio, I think he was able to get that same feeling across, but over an entire country in part 5. And just as the best parts of every other arc have come from the mystery surrounding the villain, this part plays on that very well, as the journey to find and defeat Diavolo is executed wonderfully. Diavolo's dual personality makes him very intriguing and also acts great for tension, like when he runs into Bucciarati outside the Colosseum, and his stand, King Crimson, is pretty much just a more fun version of Zawardo, where he can either see 5 seconds into the future, kind of like Pocky from One Piece, or fast forward 5 seconds into the future, where he is the only one who can perceive that time, which again gives the problem of a seemingly invincible stand, where they need to be very creative in order to win. And there are some character deaths that I think are handled very, very well, and I love the willingness to kill people in this series. Obviously, it's hard to know if anyone's ever actually dead, because it seems like every stand can heal people now, but I think this part has some of the most beautiful character conclusions in the entire series. But I do have one major problem, and that's in the ending. So far, I think every single part has completely nailed the ending, and for the most part, Golden Wind was the same, as everything was going amazing. The entire crew switches bodies, and in that, Diavolo is hiding within one of them, and they all have an Among Us moment where they're trying to figure out who it is, and up to this moment, I had no complaints. That was until Giorno got a hold of the arrow and created Golden Experience Requiem. Now, I want to preface this by saying this ability is very, very cool. The scene is animated and executed practically as well as it could be, but to be honest, it feels kind of unearned to me. It didn't feel like Giorno was the reason they were able to pull through, but more that he was just a vessel for Golden Experience Requiem. And although I know that was literally the case, I just felt unsatisfied right at the end of an otherwise stellar conclusion, not to mention the random insert of a random flashback right after the conclusion of the arc. And on top of this, characters like Fugo and Koichi never ended up coming back to the story, which just made me wonder why we spent any time developing them at all. And I know I just spent the last minute or so nitpicking the ending, but I'm going to give part 5 a 10 out of 10. Now, it's not perfect, there are issues, but upon watching episode 11, something just clicked in my head. I began to see JoJo's less as a TV show trying to tell a compelling narrative and more as a piece of art. Part 5 was the Mona Lisa, and the parts that preceded it began to look more and more like rough drafts of that eventual masterpiece. And slowly, like dominoes falling, I began to love every bit of JoJo's. The 8 out of 10 I gave part 1, the 6.5 I gave part 3, and the 9 out of 10 I gave part 4 all slowly turned into 10 out of 10s. Because at the end of the day, JoJo's to me is art. And I truly believe after finishing part 5, it is one of the purest pieces of art I've ever had the pleasure of witnessing. It takes inspiration from every facet: architecture, music, fashion, classic art, modern art, and puts it onto the page with a style and flair that no one else can. And now I finally understand why JoJo's fans never shut up about it, because I'm that fan now, begging everybody I know to watch it, because once you understand it, there's nothing quite like it. It's not something you could really explain. It's just a feeling that's transferred directly into you from author to reader, animator to watcher. And that feeling that JoJo's gives you is what art is to me. It doesn't need reason or explanation. It's a feeling that no one can explain. And I truly believe that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is an artistic masterpiece. Thanks for watching.